Senate side of the Criminal Justice Committee. So he's been heavily involved in gun policies here, both in the House and in the Senate. So we're really lucky to have three leading voices on this issue here today. And so thank all of you. Thanks all of you for being here. I want to just give you a chance to talk for 3 to 5 minutes about your views on the Second Amendment, and also your views on this law that was passed. Why did you propose it? Why did you sponsor it, Eric? And on the other side, Mark, why did you oppose it? And Stan, I want to get your views on it as well. So maybe Eric, you can kick it off.
Sure. Is the mic on? Everyone can hear me all right? Great. Well, first I just want to say, well, thank you for the introduction. I'm Senator Eric Brakey. I represent the people of Auburn, New Gloucester, Poland, Minot, and Cannon Falls in the state Senate. And first I just want to say I'm really honored to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion with two of my colleagues. And while we're going to be debating and maybe on different sides of this issue, I know that I've had the pleasure of working on the same sides of different issues in the legislature. I know with Representative Dion, I have a lot of respect for him. I know that when I put forward legislation on criminal justice reform, he was one of the first people I went to for advice because of his experience there. And Stan, well, Stan and I enjoyed him heckling me from the back row in the Senate. So. Anyway, so let's just jump into this. And I think it's useful to start with what exactly is, first of all, what is Maine law currently, and how is Maine law changing next week on the 15th? Because I think that there has been a lot of different speculation and misinformation about what exactly the constitutional carry law change is. Some of that's just unintentional, people make honest mistakes. Some of it, I think, from certain out-of-state groups that you may have seen TV commercials from, I think was a little bit of intentional misinformation. So under Maine law currently, if you are a law-abiding citizen without a felony record, without a diagnosed mental illness that would prohibit you from carrying, so if you're a law-abiding citizen, you can already open carry in any place where it's allowed, in public places where it's not otherwise permitted. So businesses can put up their own prohibitions on people carrying. There's different places in law that are specifically prohibited. But under current law, if you're a law-abiding Maine citizen, you can already open carry. So this new law, the constitutional carry law, does not change anything about who can carry a firearm. Everyone who is currently prohibited will still be prohibited. It doesn't change anything about where people can carry firearms. Every place where it's currently prohibited, it'll still be prohibited. It doesn't change anything about what kind of firearms may be carried. Every firearm that is prohibited currently will still be prohibited. The only thing this changes is how a person may carry a firearm, specifically a handgun. An individual who can already legally carry a handgun in an open manner, so you have it at your hip, visible in a way that anyone can see, you can put a jacket on without being treated as like a criminal by the state government, and without having to jump through a lot of legal hoops that often take months time for you to get that permit. So that's essentially what the law changes. In truth, I think there's been a big deal made about it, but in truth, I think the change is a very moderate one. All we're saying is that you can put on a jacket, or you can put it in the glove compartment of your car, or you can put it in your purse, or you can do these. You can have it in a way that is not completely visible for all the world to see, without having to jump through legal hoops to do so. That's what the law change is. How am I doing on time so far?
Yeah.
All right. Now, some of the reasons, and we'll get a lot more into kind of the debate on the pros and cons and why this is a valuable change or not. So I'm not going to have the opportunity during this first initial statement to make all the cases, but I just want to share two stories about why I think that this is a very valuable change. The first story is the story of a close friend of mine, a young lady who would prefer to remain anonymous. This friend of mine, in her early 20s, she had a stalker. Now she is someone who grew up in a family, grew up around firearms, knows everything about gun safety, knows how to handle a handgun. She's someone who, I would trust day after day, with a firearm. But she had a stalker, and she was in a situation where she didn't have her concealed carry permit. At the time, the process for getting that permit could take months. So she had to make a decision. Does she choose to carry in violation of the law and risk being punished by the law in order to defend herself in the event that that stalker were to take action against her? Or, out of fear of the law, does she leave herself defenseless in the event that stalker tries to harm her? That's the choice she was confronted with. And another situation, actually a former state senator who now runs is the director of Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. He told a story during the testimony on this bill of a time that he came home from the legislature and there was a death threat against him and his family on their voicemail answering machine, an anonymous death threat. At the time, now this is again someone who had a concealed permit in the past, had gone through all the training, knew the ins and outs of firearms, but that permit had expired, and at the time it could have taken upwards of 6 months of getting that permit renewed. Does he carry a firearm in violation of the law in order to protect himself and his family in the event that person who made that death threat decided to take action? Or in fear of the law, does he leave himself defenseless? I think that when the law is presenting people with this choice of being able to defend yourself or being in compliance with the law, then that suggests to me that there's something wrong with the law itself, and we need to really analyze that, and that's what this law change does. And as we kind of debate this more and more, and we go into some more of the questions, I'd be happy to talk, a lot more in depth about the issue. Thank you.
So Representative Dyer, let me sort of send it to you. And so, Senator Brieke says this is a minor change. Open carry was already allowed. Concealed carry was already allowed with permits. Why did you oppose the change?
Well, I don't think necessarily it's a minor change. And I have to say, when I saw the senator open his folder, I wanted to move for discovery. I feel unarmed or ill-prepared because I'm not sure what kind of data he's going to put forward. And I think one should note that any public policy has with it the capacity to produce what I call horrible anecdotes. All right? There's no policy that I've ever confronted that isn't laden with the possibility of that type of storytelling. But I think there's a couple of objective variables that you should consider. One, the notion of the permit was to provide competency, the idea that the person carrying the weapon had an ability to discharge it. And that seems somewhat of a clinical observation, but I can tell you, in my former life as a police officer, I knew nothing of firearms when I first started, so I had no bad habits, and I concluded my career as a distinguished expert in the use of handguns. So I think I can get around a wheel gun or a magazine firearm and be effective with it. But I do know in combat my proficiency will be cut in half, because then it becomes real that I'm in a life and death situation, and it's surprising how quickly your mind falls in that situation. So when police chiefs and others advocating for concealed weapons permits, the idea of competency and training, making it mandatory, and having a demonstration of that skill is essential, because if their anecdote is true that a bad guy only needs a good guy, gal, with a firearm, I'd like to make sure they can be on target, all right? Because there's no reeling that back in afterwards. The other part is, I have no problem with open carry. I've enjoyed the videos produced, I think, by some former classmates here regarding their confrontation with the police while they were carrying a sidearm or shouldering a long gun. I don't have a problem with that, because it gives adequate notice to the community that you're so armed, and we can deal with it accordingly and hopefully follow the tenets of the Constitution when we do that. In order to enjoy the privilege of carrying concealed, the government, through its process, has declared that you have to have a permit. Now, some states have may issue. Maine happens to be a shall issue. Now, which means if you don't meet any of the categories that are still illegal in order to possess a firearm, then you would get a permit. In Maine, however, there was a provision in the law that gave the police executive the discretion to deny you on some subjective terms their assessment of your history or propensities for criminal conduct, and therefore deny you that permit. I, for one, have always thought that should be expunged from the law. It only added an argument that someone could have been discriminated against, right? And that created a backup in some communities. The other thing is, all politics is local, all permits are local events, either through the state police or the police chief, if he or she is willing to assume that responsibility in the municipality. Now, the good senator referred to the months and months of waiting. Well, in a general sense, he's right, but in a specific sense, I take umbrage in the sense that some agencies dispatch that responsibility quickly and efficiently, others did not. Now, we spent 2 years, the Senator Kozowski and I and our colleagues, redesigning the concealed weapons permit system to enhance its ability to respond and provide permitting to the individuals as quickly as possible. So I think we were ready to do that. Now, I thought they had a brilliant stroke when they said legal, illegal. I thought, you know, sometimes arguments aren't won on an intellectual argument. Legal, illegal. You really did catch fire, and I credit the senator and his colleagues that they were able to muster support in the legislature based on that argument. That's a hard one to come up with. Because as far as police officers are concerned, every one of you are armed unless we prove otherwise. We should treat you accordingly. So the other point I want to make about the statute is it clearly was, if you look at the voting, a regional issue. The populations that we would refer to as cities tended to track against it, and the more rural counties supported it. And lends credence to one of their arguments, what I agree to, is that the police will be there in minutes, events take seconds. And if you're in certain counties in Maine, it's not unusual to have a response hour as opposed to response minutes. And 3 minutes in a life and death situation, even in the city of Portland, is a long time to wait for relief. So in that sense, I saw representatives and senators vote their region as opposed to their particular party. And that accounts for the fact that there was a majority vote supporting that concept. Now, interestingly, this law also provides that if you're engaged in this, I don't know why they call it constitutional carry. I mean, that's an interesting term all by itself. But you don't want to get into language today, Professor. Nonetheless, this non-permit concealed carry, they did reserve the right to get permits should they elect to take their firearm into other states and to enjoy reciprocity with other states, because there's not necessarily agreement among all 50 jurisdictions as to what constitutes appropriate characteristics to be provided with a concealed weapons permit. So the debate was very interesting, I thought, in the House. I can't speak for the Senate, but it was clearly something that marked regional differences in our ideas about adequate police service in a particular geography and whether or not I was going to deny someone an ability to protect themselves or their family. I thought the permit system worked. I thought it made sense. I thought it ensured competency. It allowed for the presence of firearms in the community without creating alarm. I'll tell you, I'll close with this so we can move on to other topics. I find it difficult if you're a police officer to try to reconcile public alarm with the presence of an open carry firearm. So if we can provide an avenue so people can exercise their presumptive right to self-defense without creating that alarm, I think it has merit, and we thought the concealed weapons permit was a process to do that. So rejecting that on this idea that the Constitution, and we did get into language, Professor, I have to admit that. There was a lot of reference to Maine's Constitution and this right shall never be questioned. Well, we don't question it, we just believe it can be modified. And there is a gulf of understanding between the preface to that observation and its conclusion, which is we can in fact have a constitutionally allowed permit system in this state that meets public safety needs and the individual right to self-defense.
Senator Krasowski, let me ask you, you told me in advance of today that you're kind of the resident historian. You spent a lot of time in the legislature as on the Criminal Justice Committee. What are your views from the history of gun regulations in Maine? And also sort of looking forward in the future, I mean, where do you see the future of regulations or deregulation going?
Well, first I want to thank people for being here, because this is a serious issue. And I'm so impressed to see the amount of people that came out to listen to three legislators talk about it. Now, I'm kind of the old man of the legislature. I've been turned out of the House, I'm now being turned out of the Senate. So I bring some institutional memory to this conversation, especially since I've sat on the Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee, either as a freshman, or the ranking member, or a chairman for the last 16 years. And we've dealt with concealed weapons from the beginning. From 2000, we were talking about it. And every year after that. When I look at the history of this, not of this legislation, but what's currently on the book, the concealed weapon permit process, that goes back to pre-1920. It was a national movement that swept the country at the time of the bootleggers and at the time of the mobs and everybody else. When they came up to here to New England, it had a lot of support from the game wardens, the state police, people like that, because when the game warden wanted to talk to somebody in the woods about, just show him his license or something, he was concerned, they were concerned, that they could see the rifle, but they didn't know what was underneath the jacket. And that was one of the arguments they made when they passed it here in Maine. Now, there was one state, Vermont, that never passed it. They had about 300,000 people at the time, or 1,000 people, and they just never took it up. So they never voted for or against it. It just didn't exist. I happen to be an old country boy from Vermont. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a professional outside of the legislature. I collect guns. I grew up with guns in Vermont, very similar to Maine, and never gave concealed weapon permit any thought until I got here, got on criminal justice, and I started learning then the benefit of the permit process. Now, one of the things that we're giving up is that when you go in to get your permit and you fill out the forms, one of the requirements that Representative Dion brought up was this quirky little part that we had in there about good moral character. That meant that law enforcement, usually the chief of police of a small town, knew the people that were coming in and applying for these permits. Now, they might not have been arrested, they might not be a felon, they might not have had to go to court every week for drunken disorderly charges like that, or violence. But that officer knew that behind closed doors in their private life, they might be doing all these things, or they were doing these things. They knew a person's good moral character. Now, Maine, unlike most other states, has that clause in there. And I think that in some cases it probably gave too much discretion to the local authorities. But remember, it's not only the sheriffs or not the sheriffs, but the local law enforcement, but it's also local selectmen. And it's the local counselors that give out these permits. Some of them really look worse than a Cracker Jack box. The card, Mark and I.
Can I just jump in on that? The senator brought up a good point. The concealed weapon permit system wasn't without its flaws. I spoke about police chiefs or the state police being the originating source for the permit, but the truth of the matter is, selectmen in small towns could also issue a permit. Some of the permits were at least as large as a high school diploma, folded in 16ths, carried in a wallet. You can imagine what that looked like upon inspection. Others had, in more organized municipalities, something that looked like a state liquor ID. So there was a real variety of processes to get to the end result, and the final product wasn't consistent at all. So we were trying to create some uniformity both in the procedures to make the decision and also in the end product, because officers in the field needed to know that they could rely on a particular document to do that. And because of that, there were various understandings of the law across the states. You're getting different results in different timelines.
And if we're all just jumping in here, I will say. I didn't realize the format allowed jumping in. But,
Well, I'll give you
but
the
since,
answer,
But
and then I'll
that's
ask.
happened in the House, Senator.
I guess.
I wasn't done.
Uh,
I wanted to take out your two examples.
Oh, well, if we're talking about the good moral, since we are talking about the good moral character clause, and we are jumping in. You know, I agree with Representative Dion that I think the good moral character clause is far too subjective. I mean, I know, for example, someone who was actually an outspoken progressive Democrat who was a big supporter of constitutional carry. And the reason is, I mean, this person is a fine, upstanding character person in their community, but they were denied a concealed carry permit under the good moral character clause.
Of course, to be
Why?
as a lawyer, you have to pass, pretty much everyone in this room has had to pass, we have to pass a good moral character test, which is also.
Yeah. Or if you're a lawyer, you might automatically fail the good moral character. No, I'm joking. But the point I was going to say, so this
Okay, don't you guys get too warmed up here.
Hold on, I just want to finish my point. The point is to say, the question is why did this individual, who's a friend of mine, who's a progressive Democrat, good upstanding member of their community, why did they get denied on the good moral character clause? Well, you don't really get given an explanation, but he also happened to be an open homosexual. Who knows? I mean, when it's something as subjective as that, who defines what good moral character is? So I agree with Representative Dion that I think it's far too subjective, and we should. I think it's an anti-pass.
Let me jump in with a question, because we have so many questions submitted by students, and I want to make sure we get to some of their questions, and also the live audience questions. So last week, President Obama, maybe relying on an article, National Journal posted an article last month with the title, "The States with the Most Gun Laws See the Fewest Gun-Related Deaths." And President Obama, maybe relying on that article, said, "We know that states with the most gun laws tend to have the fewest gun deaths." So the article had sort of a list of all the states and the regulations that they have. And the 10 states with the highest number of gun-related deaths were Alaska, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Wyoming, Oklahoma, Montana, Tennessee, and South Carolina. And the common features of all of those states were they didn't require permits to purchase guns, they didn't employ universal background checks, they didn't have waiting periods for handguns, they generally make it very easy to get a concealed carry permit, and generally make it easy to get an open carry permit. The states with the fewest, Hawaii, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, all typically fell on the other side of the spectrum, not universally. In New Hampshire, it was on the sort of the nice list in the journal, and it doesn't require an open carry permit, so it's not uniform. But looking at these numbers, are you concerned that as you have sort of greater deregulation, Maine would slide into the, I mean, we're kind of in the middle on this survey, would slide into the Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama side with greater gun violence and gun crimes?
So let me tackle that, and I'm going to operate on the premise that all the data is correct. I think sometimes different organizations with different agendas, data, what did Mark Twain say? There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. But first, I think it's a mistake to look purely at gun incidents when we're talking about this. I think that's the obvious place you go, but I think we should be looking a little broader than that. So, for example, Vermont. Vermont is a state. Vermont is the original constitutional carry state. They're one of the states with the highest amount of guns per capita. They're also ranked one of the safest states in the nation. Well, the safest state in the nation. They have the lowest violent crime rate per capita. Now, when we hear people say that, oh, states with more guns have more gun incidents, well, that's kind of like saying that, houses with swimming pools in their backyard, you're 5 times more likely to die of drowning. Well, that's kind of obvious. I mean, you can't die from a gun if there isn't a gun, but you can die from a knife. You can die from, a gun is just a tool that can be used as a weapon. A knife can be used as a weapon. Let's look at Great Britain, for example. Great Britain is often pointed to as a country that has very strict gun control laws, and guns are not as accessible to people. So what's going on in Great Britain right now? There's a whole campaign. It's surrender your knife, save a life. The criminals who are intent on doing harm, they'll find a tool that they can use as a weapon. Well, the big problem is that we're disarming the very people who use these tools for self-defense purposes. And even if we just look here in the United States, let's have a tale of two cities. Let's look at Chicago versus Houston. Now, these are two cities that are very similar in terms of demographics. For example, they're both population, Chicago's a little bit bigger, 2.7 million people. Houston, 2.15 million people. Median household income is both around 37,000. In terms of racial demographics, they're actually pretty similar. Non-white population is about a quarter, and the rest is various minority groups. Now, when you look at Chicago, here's where the differences arise. Chicago does not have, or has not, and this data is as of 2012. As of 2012, Chicago did not have a concealed carry gun law. Houston, Texas did. In Chicago, there were 0 gun stores. In Houston, Texas, there were 184 dedicated gun stores, plus 1,500 legal places to buy guns, including Walmart, Kmart, sporting goods, etc. In 2012, in Chicago, there were 1,806 homicides. In Houston, there were 207. So homicides per 100,000 people, 38.4, and in Houston, it's 9.6 per 100,000. So we're going to see a huge disparity in two cities with similar demographics. One of the major differences is how accessible firearm ownership is to the average person. I think one of the great mistakes we make when we look at passing more gun control laws, more gun control regulations, we think that the criminals care about the laws, and they don't. The truth is that firearms or other weapons that can be used in their place will always be available to someone who has the intent. They will always find the means to do harm. The problem is when we pass all these gun control laws, the criminals go around it. But law-abiding citizens who have respect for the law are the ones who end up having their hands tied and are the ones left defenseless. I mean, you look at something as well-meaning as, here we are today, gun-free zones. Well, time and time again, this is one of the big gun control measures we see all over the place. Gun-free zones. You put up a sign that says guns are not allowed here. Well, geez, I would love to meet the person who's intent on committing harm against and intent on committing a mass shooting, who sees the gun-free zone sign and says, "Oh, I guess I better go home. This isn't a place where this is allowed." No, we see time and again. If there was a study from the Crime Prevention Research Center between 2009 and 2014 in the United States, there were 25 mass shootings. 92% of those mass shootings took place in gun-free zones. So when we erect these barriers to firearms ownership, we are not disarming the criminals. We're disarming the people that we would rely on to choose an old cliche. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, whether that be a law enforcement officer or a well-trained, competent citizen who happens to be carrying at the time. And I think we should be looking at the wider violence rates, the wider violent crime rates, not just gun crime rates.
Yeah, Senator Grasowski, do you have a response?
Yes, I've been sitting here patiently listening to you.
Well, there's 2 of you and 1 of me, so I got it.
And that's okay, I told you to answer every question twice. But I'm gonna make this statement once, and I know that Mark will say it much more eloquently. That when I got on the committee in 2000, the murders that were committed in Maine with a gun were called domestic violence. All our murders in the state of Maine are by the ones that say they love us the most. Now that's a fact. When you look at gun crime in the state of Maine, this state has a gun culture. Most Mainers grow up around guns, and they have a deep, abiding respect for their guns. When you go to Houston, Texas, like any place else in Texas, you have a gun culture. People were brought up with guns. When you go to Chicago, you're running into a much different situation. People in Chicago don't necessarily have that gun culture inherited from parents and generations before them. So you have a little different situation. You can make statistics say whatever you want, And the statistic of gun-free zones being a dangerous place to be, I doubt it. Because people don't necessarily, bad people can get guns, baseball bats, and knives, and do anything else they can. The reason they're a bad person, the reason they're a criminal, is because they don't pay attention to the law. They don't obey the law. They don't obey the common norms of society. The people that were getting gun permits, and I had quite a few of them come to my office hours this weekend in Brunswick, were very concerned about this because they believed in the process, they believed in the training that was mandatory, they believed in the background checks that were mandatory. You could buy a gun in the state of Maine without any background check, but you couldn't get a concealed weapons permit without a background check. And so where you can go today and open up Uncle Henry's and go out and buy a gun without any kind of a background check, you couldn't go to your local law enforcement or to the state police and ask for a concealed weapons permit without that same background check. So when we talk about these figures, these scenarios, David Trahan, the head of SAM, past state senator and representative, I've served with him a long time. One of the incidences that Senator Brakey was talking about, certainly could have carried a gun any place he wanted to take it, openly. He certainly could have protected himself and his family by calling the state police as a state senator and talking about the problems that he was having. When we held committee hearings on concealed weapons and on many other gun issues, the state police gave me personal protection because there were so many death threats put against me and Senator Alpine from here in Portland that we had to have special security for a while. We lived with those as state senators, as politicians all over the country. A lot of people yell at us for a lot of funny things. You know, a lot of people just need to vent, they don't really come looking for us, openly. When Senator Brakey was talking about a young lady that was in fear of her life, we on the committee, a good 5 or 6 years ago, had worked with the state police to give a person, especially a woman, in a domestic violence situation, in fear of her life, a concealed weapons permit. We hid their name so that it wasn't public. We didn't want the perpetrator, the person that was threatening them, to know that she had that person didn't want anybody to know, so we gave them that. We gave them a 24-hour. They could have that permit in 24 hours, mostly in 2 hours. They could get that permit to carry. We did that in the legislature, in the Criminal Justice Committee, working with the state police because we saw a need, and that need was filled. So this instance that I just heard of doesn't pan out to the laws that we made to prevent that from playing out, unless that happened 20 years ago. And I don't think that happened 20 years ago. So I think that we were working on concealed weapons permits from 2000 till this year that I was there for, that I voted on, that I was involved with, along with Mark Dion and others. Ann Haskell here in Portland, very strong support of gun legislation. We had worked at bringing down that backlog, 6 months, which is a curious thing. When you understand that for years and years, everything was running about 30 days. For years, never had a problem, until we elected a black fellow. And when we did that, gun registration went through the roof, gun sales went through the roof. And so all of a sudden we had a lot of people, and it really was a tremendous spike when President Obama was elected, of people wanting concealed weapons permits. That's what actually created the backlog. That was a purely temporary backlog because, as Representative Dion mentioned, we whittled that down in committee because it became a real problem. You have to wait 6 months for any permit. It's too long. So we whittled that down to a couple of weeks, 30 days at the most. I know that to be true because I asked the state police that very recently. Been asking that all year. How do we do? We put a little bit of extra money in for some extra help to get that list knocked down, and we did it. And so, talking about concealed weapons has been going on for, in my world, for 20 years at a serious level. We have made many amendments to the concealed weapons permit process, such as giving somebody that's in fear of their life in domestic violence issues a way to get a permit very quickly. But we did take out the mandatory training, because the state should never sanction people to be carrying a hidden gun. I don't call it concealed weapon, I don't call it constitutional carry, it's a hide-a-gun program. You wanna hide a gun, put it in your pocket, and now you can do that.
Well, let's throw out language. Let me throw out another question for Representative Diane. So a point that you raised a little bit earlier about constituencies. I want to have a sense of how well do you guys sort of keep track of what your constituents believe, and how well do your views sort of reflect those opinions? And one of the questions that I got from a student, and I haven't seen this survey, is a survey from 2015, 802 Maine registered voters, 84% opposed permitless carry. So I want to have a sense of how well, sort of, when you vote on committees, or in the Senate or in the House, do you consider what your constituents believe, or do you have your own views on what you think is the best policy and vote according to your views?
That goes to about every piece of legislation when you think about it. Can I just pause for a second and go back to the previous question on the presidency? I feel like I'm in a presidential debate. Nice question, but this is the one I'm going to answer. I want to say, I think what the issue has been in those states, it's not a concealed permit issue or lack thereof. I think it's point of sale. And I want to stress that today. This is like a 9-inning ball game. The good senator's got the first 4 innings down. I'm replacing the pitcher. I mean, the real debate in this game is going to be point of sale regulation. We need universal background checks. And I look forward to our debates with our colleagues on universal background check, because if they believe that there's this derivative right to self-defense, then I claim a similar right on a community level to make sure that our interests as a collective are protected by having a universal background check at the point of sale. If that occurs, his arguments have more water with me. If he fights that, and I mean you in a collective you, not you personally, Senator, but it might be you, then he's empty, all right? He has got to support universal background checks if he believes that there has to be an exercise of self-defense.
Well, I'm going to let him answer that. What are your views on universal background checks? Do you support them? Would you support them?
I think all the incidents that we hear about in the media where we get outraged and we say something needs to be done, we need to have some action on gun control measures. I think people would be hard pressed to find a single instance where a background check would have prevented that from happening, or any of the proposals that come forward from happening. The reason that I strongly object to increasing background checks is because, well, first of all, it wouldn't have stopped any of these incidents. And what is a background check? A background check creates a record of every time there is a firearm purchase, it creates a record. That's a backward way to create a gun registration. That's what essentially you create the infrastructure for, a gun registration. And the reason a gun registration is very dangerous, I can point to a couple instances. First of all, you look in New York State. The New York State legislature voted to ban certain firearms. Well, how do they know which firearms people have? Well, they look up at their gun registration and say, oh, Sally Joe over here, she's got one of the prohibited firearms. She needs to turn it in. If she doesn't turn it in, she's out of compliance with the law. You look at New Orleans in Hurricane Katrina. Think about, is there any instance in our society where someone would need to defend themselves more than in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, where these mobs and riots going on? And what did law enforcement do directly after directly in the aftermath? They went around, they used their gun registry to go around and confiscate people's firearms and disarm them. So I think a gun registry is very dangerous. And I think any system that we're creating, where we are creating a record of which law-abiding gun owners own which firearms, and so that we're tracking law-abiding citizens, I think that's very dangerous.
It's going to be an interesting winter session. Listen, I believe in universal background check. I tried to push a bill through. I even did a modified one in this last session in the previous session that passed by a couple of votes, but was rejected because they didn't want to attach strict liability to gun owners that are selling firearms without the benefit of the background check. Look, there's a lot of this hyperbolic statement about, criminals don't follow law. Well, what's new? There's a good part of you here will be criminal defense lawyers or prosecutors. If we could cure crime, you've invested a lot of money to do nothing. But we do know if we put certain barriers in place, it reduces the frequency. I'm not an idealist. I don't believe necessarily that a universal background check will prevent massacres. Those will occur, and it's unfortunate. And there are a lot of other questions that have to be answered if we really want to deter or intervene in the possibility of those incidences. A universal background check isn't that panacea for those type of events. But it will be the barrier that will reduce some of the frequency regarding the access of firearms by criminal elements. Maine has a lot of its weapons go south to the very states that the professor outlined, all right? They come up here and buy it through third parties, and off they go. I think a universal background check makes sense. Now, if he represents, or his constituency are law-abiding citizens, pretty much like mine, and they already participate in a universal background check because they think it's reasonable and don't see it as an untoward intrusion in their privacy or their right to exercise the Second Amendment, then I think it should apply to everyone in every circumstance when a firearm is transferred. What I'm talking about when I speak about universal background checks is not the exceptional events that the Senator's describing. I'm talking about a really simple idea, because I am one, as a responsible gun owner. If we truly believe the idea of responsibility is co-committing with your right to do something, then participating in a universal background check should not be seen as a first step to the government making a registry and checking up on you. I mean, I haven't seen any of the basis for these helicopters with the black suits jumping up. It makes great television, but if any of you think by collecting up your personal firearms you could repel that kind of federal intrusion, good luck. All right, good luck. I think that frightens people, and it makes great theater, but it's not a reality. The reality is weapons leave Maine. It's called the Iron Highway. It leaves here, it goes to Massachusetts, it goes to New York. Bloomberg doesn't invest money in Maine because he got up one morning and think we're great people up here. He knows from his own public safety executives that's where the firearms that are plaguing his city comes from. All right, and it's the same in South Carolina and North Carolina and other places. They move down that way. When I heard you talk about Houston and Chicago, interesting data, but I need some more data, like the rate of poverty, the frequency of addiction, racial demographics, use of force by police. That tells a much more complex story about why firearms predominate in their cultures, all right? It's not unusual that the cities struggle with the idea of public safety and firearms, and more rural constituencies talk about firearms as tools. I have some tools at home. I don't confuse them with my skill saw, all right? My skill saw, I guess I could kill somebody with it. I mean, it's a really sophisticated knife, rotates lots of teeth at you, but that's not its intent. When I look at one of the weapons that I own, it has only one intent, either to deter somebody from taking my life or my intent to take your life. You don't draw unless you intend to kill. This idea of wounding and all that, those are corollaries that don't make sense in a combat situation. If
We
you
only have
make
a couple
decision-
minutes left, and I just want to make sure at least we have a chance to give a chance to people in the audience to ask one or two questions. So anybody have a question that they want to ask we haven't covered yet?
First of all, this is coming from a 13-year Army veteran, former Army Ranger, and went into Afghanistan. And I can tell you that, in a situation that open carry makes that person who openly carries and everybody around them a target for those who intend to do harm. Now, how does a piece of paper determine the capacity or the competency of a person's ability to use a firearm, especially when, as you so put it, gun shops have the ability or could have the ability to do a background check and do a mental capacity check?
In the concealed weapons,
Did you want someone specific to address that first, or Representative Dion, or?
Yes.
Oh, it's there.
I'm slow. Well, what's your specific question? What do you,
How does
I was in the Coast Guard, you see, we're confused.
how does the concealed weapons permit essentially help with the safety, I suppose, of the person who's carrying the weapon?
Well, I think the assumption behind the permit system is that it would require training, so there's some basic competency. I mean, you're a professional at arms individual. You know it requires some education, some familiarization with the use of that weapon. I think that was one of the rationales for the concealed weapons permit. The ability to do a sufficient background check was also to identify people that might have some persistent mental health condition that would warrant consideration as to whether or not they have a permit. And what we discovered while doing a review of the permit system is not all facilities in Maine that provide mental health intervention and treatment were reporting out. So you actually were getting a report that was somewhat invalid to begin with. So those were the goals, was to try to ensure those types of issues could be met.
But there were also the requirement, I'm just gonna butt in, there were also the
Like,
requirement
wait a minute,
of
and
getting that permit, was that they had, before you get the permit, you had to go into some training. And the training was pretty good NRA kind of training. Most of the instructors in the state of Maine are NRA instructors for the concealed weapons permit. So that added a lot of expertise to a person that might not have any expertise. There was 147 people in Cumberland County last year that were denied the concealed weapons permit. The 15th, they'll be able to carry guns.
Senator Rico, you have the final comment on this, since we go to class, let's finish it here.
So I'll try to wrap up very quickly. I think you bring up some very good points. First, because this has been brought up a lot, and I haven't really addressed it, I do want to address the question of training, which you brought up. My colleagues raised the point of, well, with the current concealed carry permit requirement, there's a guarantee that there's a certain level of training. Well, that's kind of true, kind of not. I mean, here in the state, you have a wide disparity in terms of the training institutions that are available to people. You have, on the one hand, you have these real centers of excellence, Top Gun in Poland, Maine, to plug a business in my district. They do really excellent, full-day, hands-on concealed carry courses. You spend the whole first half of the day learning the law, then you're in the gun range, hands-on with instructors. It's an excellent course, and you really get a lot out of it. But on the other end of that spectrum, there's something that has been somewhat disparagingly called certificate mills. These are places where you're in and out in an hour. You never touch a gun. You learn a brief overview of the law, and then you're good to go. At the end of either of those courses, you have that piece of paper, you have that permit, and if your only goal is to get that piece of paper, you're going to go to certificate mill. That's the easiest way to go. But if you really are interested in training, you're going to go to a place of training. So I think the law kind of creates a situation where it's this classic case of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. We can try and try, but if someone's interest is training, they'll get training. In fact, in Arizona, when they became a constitutional carry state in 2010, we saw that training went up when it became optional, because we removed this government mandate where we have this plateau, where you say, at this point you've received enough training, you are a good-to-go gun owner. No, I mean, anyone who's really immersed in firearms knows that it is a continual process. It's a lifelong process of acquiring skills and refining those skills.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time.
Right.
I just want to thank you, the three of you, for coming here. As you can see, there's lots to talk about here. We can talk about it for days and days.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So thank you guys for coming. And like I said, come to ACS and Federal Society events in the future as well.